You know exactly what so-and-so is doing on vacation. You know that the girl who went to school with you just had a baby. You know that couple that seemed perfect broke up. You know, so-and-so changed jobs, dyed her hair, traveled to Europe, and is in an incredible phase of self-discovery. You know everything from all over the world, but nobody knows anything about you. You are there, every day, sometimes in the early hours of the morning. The screen illuminating your face in a dark room, scrolling, absorbing lives, following stories that don't belong to you, consuming other people's existences as if it were a silent need that you yourself can't quite explain. But you don't post. No comment. It doesn't show up. You exist on social media like a functional shadow, present in everything, visible in nothing, and if someone asked you why, you would probably give a vague answer. Oh, I don't really like social media. Or, I prefer to preserve my privacy. Or you would simply shrug as if the question had no real answer, but it does. The answer exists. And it's much deeper, much more honest, and much more uncomfortable than anything you've ever admitted to yourself. If this video has already made sense to you, subscribe now, because what's coming next will make you pause and think about things you've never put into words. Because the issue isn't shyness, it's not laziness, it's not a lack of content to show. The issue is psychological, and it starts long before you open any app. There is a fundamental difference, almost invisible to outsiders, between the person who uses social media for to be seen and the person who uses social media only for see. The average user opens Instagram with an implicit question in the back of their mind: what can I show? The silent observer opens with another: what is happening? These are two completely different mental states, two distinct relationships with one's own digital existence. And whoever has never stopped to realize this probably never truly understood why they act the way they do. The silent observer isn't just avoiding posting. He is operating in a cognitive mode that most people around him don't even know exists. Let's talk about who you really are, because the silent observer isn't a single type of person. It's a broad category with precise internal variations. And within that category, there are profiles that are so specific, so detailed, that when you recognize yours, you'll feel that strange sensation of having been read. The hyper observer. This person doesn't use social media for entertainment. They use it for analysis. They observe patterns. They notice when someone starts posting more, when someone disappears, when the tone of the caption subtly changes, when a friendship cools without any warning. They read between the lines of what people show, and they absorb all of this in silence, without commenting, without reacting, without revealing that they are paying attention. On the outside, it seems indifferent to networks. On the inside, it processes more than any active user has ever processed. The emotionally exhausted. He's already posted. He's already participated. He's already tried. And at some point, without a specific dramatic event, he simply got tired. It wasn't a conscious decision to stop. It was a gradual exhaustion. The energy needed to construct a narrative of himself for public consumption became increasingly burdensome. And one day, he realized he was living moments thinking about how they would look in a caption. Then something broke, and he left. Silently, without a farewell post. Someone who has an unconscious fear of judgment. This is the most common, and the least honest with himself. He doesn't see himself as someone who is afraid. He describes himself as someone who simply doesn't care about social media. But what really happens is that there's a constant emotional calculation operating in the back of his mind. A permanent filter that evaluates everything before it's exposed. And this filter is so rigorous, so demanding that nothing ever gets through. Because deep down, the paralyzing question isn't, what am I going to post? The paralyzing question is, what will they think of me? What has lost the need for validation? This one is different. This one genuinely doesn't need it anymore. It's not emotional repression. It's not disguised fear. It's a real disconnection from the social approval mechanism that keeps most people glued to social networks. He's reached a point where the idea of receiving likes simply doesn't move him at all. And that scares the people around him because it seems abnormal. But it's not. It's rare. And sometimes it's the healthiest stage of all. What you feel is that your life isn't postable. This carries a very specific, silent weight. When he looks at his own life and then at what appears on his feed, he feels a distance. An incompatibility. Other people's lives seem cinematic. His seems ordinary. And instead of questioning whether what he sees is real or edited, he internalizes the comparison and concludes, without telling anyone, that he has nothing worthy of being shown. That he himself is not worthy of being shown. This is the profile that hurts the most to read. What prefers to exist without an audience. He made a philosophical decision, even if he never called it that. He realized that the gaze of another transforms the experience. That when you know you're being watched, you start to perform. And he doesn't want to perform. He wants to truly feel. So he chose invisibility not as an escape, but as preservation. As an act of integrity with his own experience. What has become a passive consumer of other people's lives? This is the most dangerous of all. Not because he's a bad person, but because he's entered a cycle he doesn't even realize he's in. He stopped creating. He stopped participating. He stopped expressing himself. And little by little, he replaced his own life with a constant diet of other people's lives. You don't post because you're not experiencing anything that feels like your own. And you're not experiencing anything that feels like your own because you've spent the last few hours watching other people's lives. It's a silent loop. And it traps without making any noise at all. If any of these profiles resonated with you. And I bet at least one did. Comment below which one it was. It can be just the number, it can be the name. But comment. Because this video exists so you can feel less alone in this. If it makes sense so far, leave a like now. Not because of the algorithm. So you can mark for yourself that this content touched on something real. Now comes the part that nobody likes to hear. Because until now, being a silent observer seems almost romantic, almost wise. The person who sees everything without exposing themselves. The intelligent ghost who navigates the networks without leaving a trace. But there is a cost, and he is charged in silence. No bill, no warning. Straight from the emotional account. The silent comparison. When you observe without participating, you consume without context. You see the edited result of someone's life without having access to the real process. Without seeing the fights, the bad days, the anxiety before the photo, the caption rewritten 12 times. You only receive the final product, and your brain, which wasn't programmed to live in the digital age, treats that as real data, as evidence of what people's lives really are. And that's where the comparison begins. Not the loud, declared comparison. The silent comparison. The one that happens in the background, almost without you realizing it. That accumulates a vague feeling of being behind, of falling behind, that everyone seems to be getting somewhere, while you're still standing in the same place. This feeling usually doesn't have a name. It just feels heavy, assisted living. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called vicarious participation. It's when you experience something through the experience of another. It's what happens when you cry during a movie, or feel adrenaline watching a sport. It's a legitimate human mechanism, but when he takes control of his relationship with the world, something begins to change. You stop being the protagonist. You start watching. Not just on social media. In life, the person who has spent years silently observing begins to develop a paralyzing social hyper-awareness. They know too much about how things work, how people behave, the patterns and dynamics, and this knowledge, which should be an advantage, becomes an obstacle. Because when you understand too much about how the game works, it becomes increasingly difficult to want to play. The invisibility you chose is starting to choose you. In the beginning, not showing up was a decision. Consciously or not, it was an active stance. You chose not to expose yourself. But over time, invisibility ceases to be a choice and begins to be part of the identity, and then something very specific emerges. A feeling that you no longer know how to present yourself, that you've lost your touch, that any attempt to put yourself out there now would be strange, out of place, too performative, or not at all. The silence that began as protection becomes a prison with transparent walls. You can see everything out there, but leaving seems impossible. Now. Here, single quotes S. The most important paradox in this video, and it's the reason I think you've made it this far. The people who are least visible online are usually the ones who see the most. This is not romanticizing. It's clinical observation. Those who spend years consuming without producing develop a different perspective. They begin to notice things that the active user, immersed in their own narrative, simply cannot see. Notice the performativity, the careful construction of a digital persona that has little to do with the real person. Notice when someone is suffering beneath a string of happy posts. Notice when a relationship is ending 3 weeks before the breakup post. Notice when someone has become their own personal marketing department. When their entire life has been transformed into content, when real moments have been replaced by recordable moments, the silent observer sees all this with an almost unsettling clarity, and this clarity creates an ambiguous relationship with the online world. Because the more you see behind the scenes, the less you want to go on stage. But here's the part nobody tells you. Living solely as an observer is also a form of imprisonment. Different, less obvious, but real, because there is a difference between choosing not to perform and being afraid to exist. It's a choice between preserving one's own authenticity and using authenticity as an excuse to never take risks, between preferring silence and having forgotten how to speak. The observer who sees everything sometimes uses this analytical ability as a shield. They criticize the superficiality of social media as a way to justify their own absence. They see the performativity of others as proof that exposing oneself is dishonest. And so brick by brick, they build an internal narrative that makes invisibility seem like a virtue. Sometimes it's just fear with sophisticated vocabulary. There's a question that nobody asks out loud, but this is something the silent observer carries with them all the time, somewhere between the conscious mind and what they prefer not to examine closely. If I don't show up, do I exist? Not in the literal sense, but in the sense that the modern world has learned to use as a metric of presence. Because in an era where existing digitally has become synonymous with existing socially, the invisible begins to feel something strange. A loneliness that is not a lack of people. It's a lack of witnesses. You can have a rich life, deep thoughts, real relationships, genuinely beautiful moments. But if none of them were recorded, shared, validated by a number on a screen, a part of the brain conditioned by the logic of social media begins to question whether they really happened the way you felt. This is what constant exposure does to those around. It doesn't need to affect you directly. It changes the pattern. It redefines what counts as real. And those outside that pattern begin to feel, even unintentionally, that they are living on a different frequency than the rest of the world. But there is something here that needs to be said carefully. Privacy is an act of resistance, not in a propagandistic, political, noisy way. In an intimate, personal, silent way, in a culture that monetizes attention, that transforms vulnerability into engagement, that has taught people to use their own pain as a strategy for channel growth. Choosing not to show is a form of refusal. A refusal to let the gaze of others define the value of what you have experienced. Something is lost when you turn a real moment into content. It's not the memory. It's not necessarily the authenticity. It's something more subtle. It's the feeling that that moment was completely yours. That it had no audience, that it didn't need a caption, that it existed simply because it existed, without any function beyond having happened. Anyone who has never posted anything knows exactly what I'm talking about, and whoever posts everything deep down knows too. It's just that he rarely admits it, because there's a psychological cost to exposure that nobody puts in the contract. Every post is an unconscious negotiation with the judgment of others. Every story is a small emotional gamble. Every photo posted carries within it a question disguised as a statement. And when the answer doesn't come or comes in a way you didn't expect, something small hurts. Always, even when you say you don't care, the silent observer decided, at some point, to stop making those bets. Sometimes out of fear of losing. Sometimes it's because you realize that the game itself isn't worth the gamble. Sometimes because existing without an audience has a quality of presence that existing in public simply cannot replicate. And then we arrive at the most honest part of this video. There is no single right answer here. There is no psychological verdict that says the silent observer is right or wrong, healthy or sick, free or imprisoned. There is only one question that is worth more than any analysis I could make. The invisibility you chose? Is it still a choice? Or did it eventually become the path of least resistance that you never questioned again? Because there's a huge difference between someone who doesn't show up because they don't need to, and someone who doesn't show up because they don't know how else to come back. Between those who preserve their own experience and those who are using silence as anesthesia. Between those who choose not to be seen and those who are simply waiting. Without really knowing what. The piece of anonymity is real. The feeling of not having to perform for anyone is real. The freedom to live moments that are completely your own without turning them into a narrative is real. But silent isolation is also real. The feeling of watching life unfold is also real. And the fear of showing up, which grew so slowly that it became part of the personality. That's real too. Neither of these realities cancels out the other. They can all exist within you at the same time. And perhaps the first step isn't posting. It isn't showing up. It isn't anything that the digital world can measure or record. Perhaps the first step is simply to be honest with yourself about which of these realities is most present right now. Perhaps the people who never post anything aren't disappearing from the world. Perhaps they've simply grown tired of turning their own lives into a spectacle. Or perhaps they are waiting for a stage that finally feels real. Only you know. Which of these phrases described you? If this video touched on something you've never put into words before, leave a comment below. It can be just one word. It can be a whole text. But comment, because this type of content exists to create real connection. And your comment is part of that. Leave a like if you've made it this far. It's not about algorithms. It's about acknowledging that this issue matters. And the video that's playing on the screen now, I highly recommend it. It continues this conversation in a way that will make you pause it again. Until then.